Hi everybody, I'm Sergio with Mobility Direct, and today we're going to start a video series all about repairs and troubleshooting a mobility scooter, particularly a GoGo Mobility Scooter. Pride Mobility makes several GoGo scooters, including the Ultra, the Elite Traveler, the Sport, and many others. They all are put together in a very similar way, so troubleshooting them, repairing them, replacing parts can all be done in a very similar way. So we're going to get started with the series using this GoGo Ultra X 3-wheel mobility scooter. It's a very popular, top-selling scooter. It's an economy class, travel-friendly scooter that comes apart. And you are going to need some tools, a screwdriver, a drill, an Allen key set, a couple of drill bits that are either going to be hex or torque style. And I've got a wrench, a pair of pliers, and a couple of things that I'll show you along the way that you're going to need regarding the tools. Again, this is a GoGo Ultra X, but the same techniques that are going to be applied here can be used with an Elite Traveler, an Elite Traveler Plus, a GoGo Sport, and many of the other GoGos. In fact, many other mobility scooters, not just GoGos, can be troubleshot and repaired in the same exact way. So this video should be a pretty good guide that's going to teach you how to troubleshoot your scooter, see what's going on with it, and we're going to go through the entire scooter. We're going to take the entire thing apart first, and we're going to go through step by step what each component does and how to replace each component and how to troubleshoot it in case it's not working. Let's get started. All right, so to make things easier, I'm going to take the seat off, which it just comes right off. Now, if you're not familiar with these travel-friendly mobility scooters, they all work pretty much the same way. After you take the seat off, the next thing you want to do is grab the battery box, which is actually got a handle on the top here. Just pick straight up. And in this battery box, you have two batteries, one on each side here, and on the bottom, there's a terminal connector, which connects to the other terminal connection. So that's how your scooter gets power. I'm just going to take this out and put it to the side for now. The next thing you normally want to do when disassembling a travel mobility scooter is to go ahead and lower the tiller. So I'm going to take the keys out here so they're not in the way. I'm going to rotate this tiller adjustment knob counterclockwise, and as you can see, the more I loosen, the farther those teeth move apart from each other, and as you tighten, you can set the tilt of the tiller at a certain point, and those teeth are going to line up, and it's not going to go anywhere. The tiller right now is tilted pretty close to the user, and if you wanted to bring it further away while you're riding it, you would just loosen that knob and retighten. Now, the steering column has a couple of different components, not just the tiller adjustment knob, but it also has a lock here, which is currently on. It's engaged, so I can't turn the wheel. And the reason that spring-loaded tiller turning lock is there is so that when this scooter is in the back of a trunk, let's say a user is taking the scooter to Disney in Orlando, Florida, and they take it apart, they put it in the trunk like this, this prevents the handlebar from swinging from left to right uncontrollably in the trunk of the car and potentially damaging the steering assembly or some of your belongings that are in the trunk of the car with your scooter. So again, this is a spring-loaded push knob that you push in and then rotate clockwise just a quarter of the way, and basically it stays there, and that's indicating that it's locked. Now, if you push in and then rotate counterclockwise a quarter of a rotation, it's going to unlock it. We'll show you how to take all this apart soon, but I just want to show you how this scooter works first in case you're not familiar with the mechanics of it. So I'll go ahead and lock this back up, and the next thing we're going to do is I'm going to grab the seat post here, which is this big metal post that the seat falls right into. I'm going to grab that with one hand and then use this feather touch disassembly lever to pull the front of the scooter away from the rear. Now you can see the rear is completely separated from the front. Now, something to point out is you've got a few components here. You have another battery terminal connector here because you've got to send power from the batteries that connect where the battery drops into that we looked at earlier. And that, when you detach it or connect it to the rear gets plugged into this receiving end. It's another female terminal connector, and it is spring loaded. That is part of Pride's patented disassembly process, which is again known as feather touch disassembly. It's really state of the art, and it makes the GoGos the easiest mobility scooters on the market to disassemble and reassemble, and in general just to travel with. So now that you know how these two terminal connectors work, and then of course the other terminal connector that was on the battery box that meets this connector, these are some of the components that you may need to troubleshoot, and we'll show you how to in the future, but it's pretty simple stuff here. These connectors are either a male or a female. Like here we have a female connector, and here we have the male. And they have pieces of metal here that make contact with the other end, and that's how the signals are passed through, whether it's a positive, a negative, or some sort of data cable. They're all meeting, and these connectors are really important parts here that we need to know how to troubleshoot and replace in the future if necessary, and we'll go through all that. So now that we have the rear detached from the front, the chairs removed, the battery box is removed, there's really not much left as far as disassembly here. You can take the seat post out, which is just going to be held in with a securement pin, a quick release pin, and that is how you adjust the height of your mobility scooter seat. There's different holes here. Slide it into that sleeve, and really there's no repairing or troubleshooting this. This is hardware that does not break, so you don't need to worry about that too much. So now that we have it completely taken apart, what I'd like to do is begin to really break this thing down and show you the internal components, the guts of the mobility scooter, if you will. And as you can imagine, we're going to need some tools, so let's get started.
The first tool you're going to need is a screwdriver, and what you're going to do is remove the two screws that are located right where the battery sits into. There's going to be two screws. You're going to need a Phillips head screwdriver, and go ahead and just, what I do is loosen them first with my screwdriver and then get the drill to unscrew the rest of it. This is to make sure that the screw heads don't strip, and I recommend you do the same because using a drill bit can sometimes strip the screw heads. Now we're going to flip the scooter over to expose the bottom part of the frame, where we're going to see a total of we're going to see two additional screws that, again, we're going to use a screwdriver to loosen first and then come in with the drill to completely remove those two screws located at the bottom towards the front wheel. As you can see here, took out our drill bit, which is on the lowest torque setting as well to prevent stripping. A lot of these hardware screws and bolts are very soft, and if you use a drill with a higher torque setting, it's very easy to strip them. So I highly recommend keeping your drill, if you are using one, at the lowest possible setting, and again, pre-loosening those screws with a screwdriver. Once those four screws are out, the frame just comes right up and out, so you can just lift it up and see that the frame itself is going to be one solid piece. There is a floor mat that's popped in with some rivets. You can take those out by hand, but we're not going to do that in this video. At this point, we've removed the shroud cover and we've exposed the wiring harnesses for the controller as well as the battery power connectors. The power connectors are going to be used to give power to the scooter and send power back to the motor. There's also a programming little harness there with a cover on it, which you can use to program your controller. Here we're showing you that the seat post is just going to be removed so that we can make some room for the breakdown process. Now the next thing we're going to focus on detaching is the front fender shroud. We will need to detach the main power cable that runs through the steering assembly and up the steering column. So I'm going to disconnect this main 6-plug harness connector. There's a little clip that I'm using there, which you'll want to depress and then pull apart. You'll also see that there is a little buzzer there, which you can remove, and it does go ahead and connect right into the controller. A lot of people ask about that, so we're pointing that out here. Now to remove the cover, we're going to use a 532 Allen key here. Now the next thing we're going to do is remove the two front bumpers on the left and the right side of the front tire. You're going to see these bumpers. You will need a 532 SAE Allen key or similar type of drill bit, and we're basically going to just remove them here by hand because our drill bit's a little bit too big to get into those holes. Just be careful. Again, a lot of the hardware is soft and easy to strip, so just be very careful and use that Allen key to just loosen that, and you don't have to remove the hardware altogether. I would keep it with the bumper so you don't lose it. Now on the front fender cover here, or the shroud, there is a little rubber piece that goes around that wire. You just want to push it forward and then go ahead and clip all of the zip ties that are being used to hold that main cable down. Again, this is the main cable that we just disconnected, which sends all the signals up to the steering assembly at the top by the handlebars for the throttle, the horn, the ignition, and everything. So you're going to want to go ahead and get that cable out and unfish it through the hole that I just showed you there. Next, you're going to want to grab another Allen key, and this time you're going to want to use the 3/16 Allen key to go ahead and remove the nut and the bolt at the bottom part of the steering column. You're also going to need a socket, which is a 10mm socket, and just go ahead and loosen up those bolts and nuts. Again, try and keep them together so that you don't lose the hardware or misplace it. I would recommend putting it right back into the hole afterwards so you don't lose it, or just put it somewhere where you know you're not going to lose it. So there's two sets here, nuts and bolts. They do come with washers. Make sure you're careful and don't lose those washers when you're pulling them out. And what we do is we actually screw the washers and the nuts back onto the bolt to not lose them, as you can see. And you might need to shake a little bit, wiggle a little bit, but then the entire steering column will just come right off once you have those nuts and bolts removed. At this point, you can take that fender front shroud cover and just lift it straight up. As you can see, there are some metal threads here for the frame. The next thing we're going to want to grab is a 7/64 Allen key drill bit, which I'm using here, or you could just use an Allen key, but we're going to put it right into that steering lock mechanism and remove that bolt. Be very careful, it is spring loaded. So when it comes out, it will try to push out on you, and you want to grab that spring out of there too. I'm just using my screwdriver. The spring stayed behind. Make sure you don't lose that spring. It's a very important piece. The tiller lock won't work without that spring. What we're doing now is grabbing another socket. This time we're using a 13mm socket to remove the front tire. There's just a nut and a bolt, some spacers. Be careful not to lose the spacers when you remove the tire. As you can see, when you pull the bolt out, the spacers will just fall out, so just be careful. There's also a washer on the outside of the fork, so just go ahead and pull that main bolt out that goes through the entire wheel assembly, the rim, the spacers, and the washer. And again, just make sure nothing slips out of the way and falls somewhere that you can't really access it or reach it, because without those spacers, you won't be able to put the scooter back together. Again, it's not a bad idea to put those spacers right back on the bolt and keep it with the tire even by putting the entire bolt through the bearing after it's removed so that you don't lose anything. It's really good practice to do that. Once you have everything secured and put away in a safe way so that you're not going to lose it, we can go ahead and get started with the next component here. And the next component that we're going to start breaking down on this scooter is going to be the wire harness. So we're going to kind of just take apart the entire wire setup here, get the control out completely and the battery connector that's attached to the base of the frame so that we can really just show you the guts removed from this mobility scooter completely. And by the guts, I mean the controller, the wire harnesses, the fuse, the battery connectors, and all that what you see here attached to the frame. You are going to need to cut a few of the zip ties that are used to secure different wire harness cables to the frame itself so that it's all free, and then you can begin to remove the battery connector and the controller. We'll go ahead and start with the controller, which has two screws at the bottom of the base of the frame and two nuts that are used to go around that nut. You will need a 932 socket or something equivalent to remove those nuts. Go ahead and get the socket out and grab your screwdriver or your drill in this case and just be very careful. Keep everything at the lowest torque setting, and go ahead and just remove the 2 screws as well as the nuts that are used to hold down that controller. The screws are pretty long because it has to go all the way through the controller and through the cover for the controller as well. The cover is used to just keep it free from debris and moisture. Now go ahead and be careful when you're removing the hardware. There are going to be some washers involved, and you'll want to pay close attention to the orientation of those washers so that you can put everything back together later the same way it was disassembled. Once you remove the cover from the controller, you're going to see that there are quite a few different wires kind of just plugged into that. Go ahead and keep the cover on for now, and let's get started with removing the main battery connector. It's a power connector that's going to send power to different places, including the controller and the motor. So you'll need that same screwdriver and socket set that we used for the controller. And go ahead and just keep everything on the lowest torque setting and carefully remove those screws one at a time. Remember to always keep your hardware and kind of pay close attention to how it's removed. Pay close attention to how many washers, the location of those washers. In this case, we have a washer here on the bottom side with the nut on each side. And we're just carefully removing those one at a time here. Again, keeping that screwdriver at the lowest torque setting. I can't stress that enough. It's really important that you do that, guys. If you're watching this video, I'd hate to see you strip your hardware and then be forced to go and get replacement hardware, which can be hard to measure the exact size and the diameter of these different screws, bolts, and nuts. So try not to strip anything by just using the lowest torque setting. So now that you can see we've removed the 2 screws and the nuts for the battery connector, I'm just showing you the bottom that there are some pretty normal little style connectors here to send power to the different places. Some are removable, some are not. Mainly for the power connectors, including the rear one that sends power to the motor, they're not going to have removable pins on the back. They are permanent. You could, of course, splice them and resolder them if you needed to replace those connectors, but it's really rare that you would have to replace those types of connectors. They don't usually get damaged. So as you can see here, we're using the same screwdriver, drill bit, if you will, and the same socket that we were using before to remove these battery connectors. In this case, this is a male battery power connector that is fed right into the female end on the motor side of the scooter. So we're going to go ahead and put the washer and the nut together here so we don't lose anything, and then proceed to move forward with the rest of the breakdown. But now that we have the controller removed and the power connector removed, it's almost ready to just kind of pull everything right up and out of the frame. However, we do need to kind of fish out the cables for that power connector that we just detached. Now there's a little piece of grommet there that's used to hold down the positive and the negative, and then there's 2 brown cables, or 2 different colored cables, which may vary depending on the model and version that you have. But let's go ahead and remove those wire harnesses for the 2 cables, and then the black and the red cable, they're a little bit tougher to remove. In this case, for this particular scooter, it was really tight in there. It might not be as tight for you, but go ahead and carefully pull on the red and the black, and then that one harness with the 2 cables so that you can remove the entire battery / power connector and fish it through that frame part there that the connector won't fit through. That's why we're doing this. If it would fit, we would just slide it right out, but it doesn't fit through that little hole in the back of the frame there. So you have to actually disconnect the red and the black cable, as well as that one harness that's the white harness with the brown wires being fed into it. Once it's fished through, you can just reattach it in the same configuration, and you can actually see there's little indicators there for positive and negative for the main battery in and the battery out. So once that's out, again, you can completely remove the entire assembly of the controller and the 2 power connectors. There is a main harness cable that, again, was detached and used to send all sorts of power and signals up to the steering assembly, which we're going to get into now. The steering assembly is pretty straightforward. There's going to be a total of 6 screws on the bottom part of that dash. You're going to want to get your screwdriver, and I would recommend just using your screwdriver for the outside 4. They are going to be different than the middle 2 screws. So I'm starting with the bottom 2, and then I'm moving up towards the top 2. Those are the 4 that are going to be the same size and type of screw. But then the middle screws there that are kind of right into the handlebars, it seems like, which we'll get started with next, those are going to be a different style type of screw, a little bit bigger. So just pay close attention to that so that you don't get confused when you're rebuilding the dash and putting everything back together. So we got the first 4 out, which are all the same size, and now we're starting on the last 2. And you're going to see here when I pull it out that they're a little bit bigger, longer threading, and we're going to want to keep those separate. So here I'm going to actually use the drill because those screws are a little bit longer and it could take a little while. And as you can see, they were a little bit longer. Again, the 2 in the middle there, keep those separate, and we'll show you how they were different here. You can see one has a pointed end, it's a little bit shorter, and then the 2 machine style screws for the main screws are a little bit longer. And now we have the dash disassembled. We're just exposing it to you to show you how the harnesses are connected, and you will need to disconnect the harnesses. It's just got a little clip there that we're showing you, so make sure to push down on that clip before you pull, and it should just detach pretty easily. Same thing with the other harness. It does have a little clip. You want to push down on it and just completely remove it. And now you have the top half of the dash with all of the components completely free from the bottom part. And we'll show you how to go ahead and get started with that. You have the battery meter, the horn button rather, and the ignition, which all of these components are pretty straightforward. You do have a buzzer in there as well for the horn, which will show you how to disassemble all of this. First, we're going to want to remove the throttle module. This throttle module is pretty unique. It's ambidextrous use, which means you can push or pull on the right or left side to control the forward and reverse motion of the scooter. First, you want to take off the 2 screws on the front. Just use a Phillips head screwdriver or drill with a Phillips drill bit. And be very careful, just remove it. Be very gentle. Again, all of these screws and hardware pieces are prone to stripping. Once you remove those 2 main ones, you can remove the smaller ones that are located on the top part of that throttle module, as you can see here. There are some washers. Be very careful not to lose those washers. And we'll show you how this throttle module actually works. It's pretty clever. It's just got a little mechanism there that allows the throttle to swing either forward and backwards, and it's pretty neat. It's very simple piece of hardware here, but very, very clever and very practical. So as you can see, it's just got a little spring there that creates some tension, and you can push or pull in either direction. And that is basically the throttle module that controls the signal of the voltage to either increase speed or decrease speed for your scooter movement. Now we're showing you that the main cable that runs through the top here is just one main cable with harnesses at the top. And we're going to get started with disassembling the components in the dash. The first thing you're going to want to do is just remove the throttle control cap, which will expose the little washer style nut that's around the throttle control module. You will need a 10mm socket wrench to go ahead and remove that. It's very easy to loosen it, and then I would recommend just using your fingers to take it off so that it doesn't go flying and fall somewhere under a piece of furniture that makes it hard to get to. Once that nut's removed, you can just push down. There is a washer, and the throttle module will be completely removed and detached at this point. Go ahead and screw that washer nut back on so that you don't lose it. And at this point, you can either cut the zip tie. If you just cut that one zip tie, though, the entire module will be free. And replacing it's pretty easy. It's just got a harness, so if you were to need a new one, it's very straightforward. The next thing we're going to do now is remove the battery meter. The battery meter is digital. You do need a little tweaker screwdriver, a very, very small screwdriver, and you're going to remove the 2 screws that I'm pointing out right there. And that's going to hold the battery meter right up against the dash. There's nothing really complicated about it. Just remove those 2 screws and that metal bracket comes right off. Once that bracket's off, the battery meter is going to be free and loose, and you can just take it right off. There are going to be some cables that are zip tied to the entire harness, and bunch of cables. They definitely put a lot of zip ties in there to keep everything together. Just go ahead and follow the wires and carefully see where they're going so that you can cut the appropriate zip ties to release the harness. And you're going to see that there is a pretty big harness connector here with a clip, just like all of them. And you want to just go ahead and find the way we can release that clip, or push down on the clip rather, to allow you to release the male and the female end of that clip. Just go ahead and pull apart and it should be free. And that is how you remove the battery meter indicator should you need to replace it in the future. The next thing we're going to do is work on removing the buzzer for the horn. Two very simple screws just need to come out, just like the bracket for the battery meter. Once those two screws are out, you can just simply pull the buzzer straight up and out. And we're going to keep the screws there right in the holes so we don't lose them. And you will need to cut a zip tie to release that harness. You're going to notice that there's actually some splicing going on for the black cable for the buzzer, and that's because it's jumping in with the black cable for a lot of the other components. So actually, if you want to replace a buzzer, you would need to do some soldering, which is not complicated, and we'll show you how to. The next thing we're going to do here is just get the washer ring that's used to hold the horn in place and just rotate it counterclockwise. You will need a pair of really strong needle nose pliers to remove that. And once the washer ring is loose and completely removed, you can do that for the ignition as well. And it's going to work the same way. You will need a very particular set of pliers to get in there because of the angle and the way the plastic molding for the dash is. It's just very hard to get in there without a particular set of pliers like the ones we have. Very long, very strong and thick angled pliers. Once you have those two washer nuts removed completely, like we mentioned, you will need to cut some wire because there's a lot of bridging going on. A lot of the negatives and the positives are being shared. For example, between the ignition and the horn, you've got bridged wires that you can't just pull and fish the components through the shroud holes there. It won't work. You have to actually cut the cables. So we're going to cut the cables and then tape them back up so that we know exactly where they go. We'll keep those wires taped together so that when we're ready to rebuild the scooter, we know that those two cables actually have to be together and that they go into the ignition. You may want to use labels or different colored tape. We've worked with these scooters for so long, so we're just using the same tape. Basically, the ignition has two cables and the horn has three. So if you can just remember that, you could probably use the same colored tape as well, like we are. And we're just going to keep them bunched together. So we're taping together the three cables that are used for the horn after we've already taped up the two cables that are used for the ignition. At this point, we have the horn button completely detached and free. We're going to put that little washer ring back on, and we also have the ignition completely free with the wire harness that has the buzzer attached to it. Now we're going to go ahead and move forward with the rear side. We're turning it upside down to show you that there's two screws in the front side of the rear and then two screws on the rear side of the motor assembly that has the wheels. You're going to want to do what we have been preaching since the beginning. Loosen up those screws first with a screwdriver manually and then come in with a drill to save time. Once you have those two screws removed, go ahead and rinse and repeat for the rear two screws that are going right there on that main frame part, right at the rear of the scooter. You can almost see them if you look underneath the scooter in the back. And those are the two main screws that are going to release the frame from the rear shroud completely. We're going to go ahead and screw those screws back onto the shroud to save them and know exactly where they go later on, which we recommend doing as well. Now you can remove the little black cover on the back shroud, but it's not necessary. Next, we're going to grab a 19 millimeter socket, which is going to be used to remove the rear tires. You are going to need to apply a bit of strength there. They are pretty tight. And when you remove that bolt, remember that there is a washer in that rim. And you want to just make sure that those washers and those nuts are kept somewhere safe. Be careful that the magnets don't fall out on the transaxle when you're removing the tire. Those magnets need to be there. If they're not there, you're going to have big problems. There's a little slot on the rim that you're going to notice. And just make sure when you're putting the tires back on that that magnet is still there on the axle, and just pay close attention to how you're removing it. Now, this rear power connector is very, very delicate. You will probably strip one of them. We stripped two of them, and we're not sure why, because we were very, very careful. However, we decided to show you what to do in the event that you strip the screws that are located on this back power connector. You're going to need some experience with a Dremel. So we're taking a Dremel with a disc that's really strong that can cut into metal, and what we're doing is we're making a slice right down the middle of the screws that we stripped. And once you make a clean slice down the middle of those screw heads, you can actually use a flathead screwdriver to get right in that little slice that you made, and that's going to make it a lot easier to remove that button style machine screw, because they're super soft and they strip very easily. So if you need to do this, this is one way to do it. However, if you're not a technician and you haven't done this before, I would highly recommend contacting a technician or a handyman to do this for you so that you don't get hurt. Dremels are very dangerous. They're very high-speed tools, and you need to have experience before just trying to use one on your own for the first time. Once you have those 4 screws removed, the power connector for the rear side motor assembly here comes right out. You will need to just fish that connector through and cut a zip tie, which is used for the cables to not move around too much as you're riding. And once that twist tie, or that zip tie rather, is cut, you can fish that out. You just need to find the right angle and just wedge it right out of that frame, so that when you detach the motor completely from the frame, it comes right out easily. There are 4 big nuts and bolts used to hold down the motor. You're going to need a 6mm Allen key and a 13mm wrench or socket to remove those 4 nuts and bolts. And we're showing you how. We're getting started here. Just go ahead and grab that 13mm wrench and the Allen key. And there's nothing to it, just simply loose, lefty loosey, righty tighty. So we're loosening it up here, and as you can see, just removing the nuts and bolts one at a time. I actually grabbed my drill with an appropriate drill bit to go ahead and speed this process up. Yeah, pay attention to those washers, ladies and gentlemen. Remember, you don't want to misplace those, so that when you're going to put the scooter back together, you know exactly where everything is. Once you remove the first one, just go ahead and rinse and repeat on the second, third, and fourth set of nuts and bolts. And you will notice that there are some pads on the top part of the frame when you're removing the actual bolt. And those pads you're going to want to make sure you don't lose. So as you're removing the bolt, you may notice that the pads stick to the top of the bolt for some of them, which is okay. Just make sure you know where you're keeping them so that they don't get lost. What we actually do is remove each one, and then we just keep them with the nut and the bolt and screw the bolt back onto the nut itself so that we know where everything is. And we recommend doing that as well. As you can see, we pretty much have broken down the entire scooter here. Now, there are a few other pieces that you could break down further. However, we're not getting into that because those really aren't parts that are very prone to breaking or parts that really need repairs ever. But you can actually break down the motor completely, and the steering column neck right above the fork you can break down a little bit further. Again, those aren't pieces that really need repairs too often, so we're not getting into that. Stay tuned for the rebuild series, where we're going to show you how to replace parts as we rebuild the entire scooter. If you liked this video, you have questions, please leave a comment below, like the video, or subscribe to our channel if you want to get notified when new videos come out just like this one. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.